and I was in the capital, Manila, and I was eating in a restaurant, and there was a lady waiting across the street till I finished eating to see what scraps she could eat from the plate. It was appalling. So they've got millions of drug addicts, and the American opposition to the drug taking in the Philippines, or the war on the drugs, is reminiscent of the British war and the Chinese in the Opium Wars. The British went to war with China 3 times to ensure that they would accept opium that was grown in India. And suddenly the Americans are terribly concerned about the human rights. In fact, there's all sorts of accusations against the American military about supporting the Islamic separatists in the South, about supporting the insurgency surreptitiously. And this is what they believe in the higher echelons in the Philippines. They don't say it publicly. But Duterte has been very outspoken. And we all know that. We've seen the headlines, what he's said about the UN, about the American ambassador, about the American president, and so forth. Well, that's his colorful language. You can be sure all the media, all the press was against him being elected. But what happened was, it was people's power. They rallied around him. He's got massive support in the Philippines. They used Facebook, which they're all addicted to, it seems, and they supported him. And now he's taking the Philippines out of the American orbit, and he said so, and to China. Now, China's granted a $9 billion soft loan to improve infrastructure in the Philippines. And that's basically what China's doing everywhere. It's building roads and railways and helping the countries. It gets a lot of rewards. It's, calculated in its investments, but it's a far cry from what we see the Western agencies doing, and the IMF, etc. Now, China's granted the Philippines fishing rights in the disputed area of the South China Sea, and they're not making a big meal of it. And let's face it, the Philippines couldn't do anything against China anyway, even if it thought it could. So he's an example to the rest of the world. He's a Gaddafi figure, a Che Guevara. He's a non-aligned figure. He's establishing sovereignty. And, it's something we've all lost. We see the banana republics, the third world countries under American hegemony, but it's also us people in the West, us citizens of Europe and America. We've lost our sovereignty. It's worth drawing the analogy. Well, you've got to wonder what will happen to him, because you can also think about Gaddafi and Chavez and what has happened to them. And it's not difficult to knock someone off if they're in your territory. So I hope Duterte does not go to New York to attend a UN session or any such like. He's better off where he is, in Asia. It's certainly a risk that he's taking in life, but bear in mind he has a proven track record. He has been a mayor of a town in Mindanao, in the south of the Philippines, and he's got support from Muslims there, and he's cleaned the place up from the drugs. And the drugs are serious drugs. Metamorphine, I can't even say it, but it causes people to be very violent and ruthless. It's not a soft drug issue. Anyway, that's the best I can do. I'm not versed in all the details of the Philippines, but he's a rising star on the international stage, and deservedly so. Not many people have turned around against usurping power like the United States with such rapidity. He's only been in power since June. I suspect they never saw it coming. The Americans are actually at a loss what to say. You've got American spokespeople and defense secretary, and they're all just spouting out mumbo jumbo. They don't know what to do. They are powerless. They can't deal with it, which is a bit wrong for me to say, because they know how to take things into their own hands. And they've got plenty of fifth columnists all around the world that can do dirty deeds on their behalf. But at this moment, they're at a loss. Philippines has aligned itself with China. It will keep to the treaties that it has with America for the time being. and it will let America play capitalism in the Philippines. But with China's help, it might, resuscitate the country into a state of decent employment and not desperate status that it's currently in. I appeal for donations at the end of every video. I often break up the videos into multi-topics. I try and keep this to one topic just about the Philippines and make a series of short videos of different topics, but that leaves me with no opportunity to ask you for donations. So please help if you can. Send something along to the PayPal address or the Skrill account. I'm one of those rare voices that are independent on the internet, which is just madness. Of all the millions and millions of people, you would expect more. Cynthia, the headlines have been about Duterte, and indeed you tweeted about him. How much of a change is he going to make? How much of an influence is he going to have on Asia?
Well, of course, Maurice, this could be huge because not the only linchpin, but one of the key linchpins of U.S. power projection in the Pacific is the Philippines. And so if that domino falls, then you could expect other states to assert their sovereignty. Now, of course, I'm just checking the news here, and I'm seeing that the president said one thing, and then there was a clarification about 7 hours ago as to what the president actually meant. And so he said that I should be able to go back and see exactly what he said in terms of not being, he announced his separation. Okay, this is what it is. He announced his separation from Washington, D.C. And then, of course, people took that to an extreme with an understanding that he thought that he was going to sever ties with U.S. And, of course, I never thought that that was what he meant. But what I did think that he meant was that the Philippines was going to assert its sovereignty, as it has not only a right to do, but a responsibility to do, if it is to be true, if the Philippine leadership is to be true to the Filipino people. And so the clarification that has been issued is that he says we are not, actually this is the trade minister speaking on behalf of the presidency, saying we're not stopping trade, we're not stopping investment, but what we are stopping is being too dependent on one side. And so this, again, I can see that there's a unipolar moment that was recognized by everybody in the world, particularly those states that were previously a part of the non-aligned movement or have been struggling to assert their sovereignty, as the Philippines has been doing ever since what? The 19th century. And so there was a brief moment when the Philippines and the extremely active civil society there were able to eliminate the US-backed dictatorship, and they were able to eliminate the presence of US troops on their soil. The US was able to maneuver its way back onto Philippine soil, but that now is being contested. And of course, the relationship with China is one that the United States, George W. Bush said, you're either with us or you're with the terrorists. And that's the approach that the United States takes. They really don't accept states being friends with everybody in the neighborhood. Well, now the Philippine government has said we're going to be friends with everybody in the neighborhood. We don't intend to attack anybody militarily. Therefore, we don't need F-35s. We don't need bombers. We don't need all of that sophisticated military equipment. And therefore, we can shop around and we can get the equipment that we need, the helicopters and the small planes. We can get that from China at a much better price.
And China is going to, I think it's giving a $9 billion in soft loans. It's going to help build infrastructure, which is something China's kind of known for throughout the world. It wins the hearts and minds of governments more than American policy. Wouldn't that be right?
Well, you know, I have had the great fortune to travel around the world. And one of the things that I can tangibly see is a result of Chinese investment in other countries. They build roads, they build amphitheaters, they build convention centers. They build things that the community can use, that countries need, and they build that. And that becomes a lasting testimony to the friendship between the people of China and the people of that particular country. And now, what does the U.S. give? The U.S. gives quite a bit of money. That money can be pocketed by the elites who have access to that money. The society, the country, the state as a whole is left holding the bag, but the individual elites in that particular country who had access to the money become fabulously wealthy. That's what the U.S. does around the world, and that is in distinct contrast to what China does around the world. I also happened to be in the audience with, I was in Kuala Lumpur, and former Prime Minister Mahathir made a comment about the Malaysian relationship with China. He said, well, you know, China never colonized, they never attacked us, and so therefore we don't have any reason to be fearful of a relationship with China. Well, you know, that cannot be said of the United States and its Western allies.
Indeed. You know, Duterte comes from the south of the Philippines, where they've had a kind of a revolt of what you might call Islamic extremists. And there's a lot of accusations that the American military has been supporting the Islamic extremists in the south. And I think this has painted the sentiment in the Filipino country, amongst the population, to also go against the United States.
Well, I was in Manila for well, actually, not for, there was a conference that took place just prior to the ASEAN conference. So I was literally trying to find any plane whatsoever that I could get out of Manila because the airspace had been shut down because all of the dignitaries were arriving for the conference. And of course, you know, Obama went there as well. And it was at that point that I was able to see that the civil society, in terms of the support for the presence of U.S. troops, the civil society, at least that I was with, is greatly opposed to it. Now, there's another point about the Philippines that I have not really had the opportunity to do much research on. I needed to get out of this conference, but the conference was actually go to Mindanao. So I was not able to go there in order to see for myself. But I remember reading that you had an insurgency in Mindanao. And when I read deeply into this particular article that was describing what was going on and why, basically, this area didn't have any electricity. And I remembered when I went to Cuba and went all the way up to the top of the mountains, and the one of the first objectives or goals of the revolutionary government was to make sure that everybody, no matter how high they were up in the mountains, that they had access to electricity. And so I remember reading this article and saying to myself, why was it that this particular area did not have electricity? And that this particular area was the poorest area in the Philippines. And so therefore, an insurgency is totally understandable when there's a lack of justice, a lack of access to resources, a lack of equitable treatment. And what do you expect people to do?
Indeed, indeed. Yeah, well, there have been accusations and innuendos based on American military involving itself.
Welcome back to The Heat. We're discussing the strained relationship between the Philippines and the United States and efforts by the Philippine president to revive ties with China. Let's get back to our panel right now. Isano, we talked a moment ago about the war on drugs. The immediate reason for the breakdown in the relationship between the United States and Philippines appears to be President Obama's criticism of President Duterte's crackdown on drug dealers. Let's listen to what the U.S. president had to say.
Our position that if we're working with a country, whether it's on anti-terrorism, whether it's on going after drug traffickers, as despicable as these networks may be, as much damage as they do, it is important from our perspective to make sure that we do it the right way.
So, Isano, it appears that President Obama has hit a raw nerve there. Why has the Philippines leader been so angered by that?
Well, I think Mr. Duterte perhaps has not been quite used to be sort of talking down to in the sense that he has been a local mayor for years, and when he was mayor of Davao, he essentially had a free hand in terms of running the city, and it was sort of a well-known phenomenon that similar deployment of, for example, death squads or calling upon the citizens to execute those drug traffickers, to take laws into their hands and so on. These sort of actions were sort of free-flowing, and nobody was essentially talking down to him, not then the president of the Philippines. And now that Mr. Duterte himself is elected the president of the Philippines, I think he's not very used to being talked down to by, for example, even the president of the United States. And the immediate knee-jerk sort of reaction is, of course, to talk back. And I think, as I said, he knew that the Americans could actually tolerate quite a large sort of a latitude of, for example, being insulted and so on. So he is going on with his insulting. But as a previous speaker also said, there is at some point some limit to it. Yeah.
Right, and Surab, that rhetoric escalated very quickly into a slanging match. Let's listen to what President Duterte had to say.
So I do not expect the human rights, I do not expect Obama, I do not expect the EU to understand me. Do not understand me. And if you think it is high time for you guys to withdraw your assistance, go ahead. We will not beg for it.
So he's saying that we don't care about the assistance you're giving us. If you don't want to give it to us any longer, that's fine. Now, as Richard pointed out, we don't know whether that's just bluster or whether he means that. But what do you make of it?
Here's an interesting facet which I think not many people touch upon, but I think is a very important one. Asia is seeing a new and different breed of leaders who have come out who are not from the existing elite or from the metropolitan centers. We've seen that in Jokowi in Indonesia. We've seen that in Rajapaksa in Sri Lanka. We're seeing that with Duterte in Philippines, and to some extent even Modi in India, though the US has good relations out there. And the US has been...
We're seeing that in the US as well, aren't we?
Well, exactly, we are. And the point is the US has been happy to talk about democracy and has promoted democracy, but has preferred to work through oligarchs in those countries. Now, Duterte comes in with a very rough and ready view of how he wants to tackle challenges which are close to his heart. And the US has difficulty coming to terms with this sort of leader, has not done this sort of outreach with provincial leaders, and has not used to this form of functioning and style. And so this sort of relationship can degenerate quickly. Of course, another thing that the US doesn't grasp too well about this is, you know, Southeast Asia has been an arena, and South Asia has been an arena where there has been colonialism, where the brunt of that colonialism has been from white countries. Unlike in East Asia, like Korea, where the main problem, or China, where the main problem was Japanese imperialism. And so the alliance structures that it has in East Asia do not easily translate in the same way and speak to the masses and their leaders in the same way that it does in Southeast Asia. And the US, I don't think, is approaching these and understands these underlying drivers that well. And that's why it needs to be a little cautious. Yes, President Duterte has said a lot of things he should not be saying and should be framing it a little bit more diplomatically, but the US must try to understand a little bit more about where and how these leaders are also coming from.
Victor, just a few months ago, an international tribunal in The Hague ruled against China for the Philippines in that territorial dispute over the South China Sea. Now the Philippines, which one could say won that dispute, is calling for a strengthening of relations with China. What's the significance of that change? That's all happened very quickly.
Well, first of all, from the Chinese perspective, that a ruling by the arbitration court based in The Hague is illegal. And China has presented its reasoning why it is illegal and why China is not going to accept its ruling or to implement the ruling, etc. And this is all on the record. And I would say that if you look around the world, there are many territorial disputes between different pairs of countries, and between China and the Philippines, indeed, there is territorial dispute. But the better way to resolve the territorial dispute, including between China and the Philippines, is to conduct diplomacy and negotiation and talk it over and try to reach an amicable solution for the two countries. And I think for President Duterte and the Philippines under his leadership, this is exactly what's the better way between China and the Philippines to engage in diplomacy, to engage in peaceful dialogue. And meanwhile, even though there may be these territorial disputes, we still can, you know, put them aside for a while and focus on cooperation between the two countries. In China, if you do that right, there could be huge demand for many products and services from the Philippines, and this will help the Philippines to create many good jobs in the Philippines and boost its export to China. And China can also provide lots of assistance in terms of financing and infrastructure capabilities. This is exactly what the Filipino people would benefit from. Therefore, I think, even though the Hague